This is a session that will focus on Syria. It will focus on the new reality of trying to cover a war with no correspondents or no Western correspondents. This has been produced and moderated by Solana Larsen of Global Voices, and we're delighted to have her and her guests here today for what I'm sure will be very powerful. I'll turn it over to Solana.
Hello and welcome. My name is Solana, and I'm the editor of a network called Global Voices, which is a citizen media community of bloggers and translators who cover news in social media in 30 different languages. Watching this conflict unfold via the internet and mainstream news, it strikes us, it strikes me personally as well, how much the media has come to rely on citizen media video. And of course also, the dangers that we've seen, the difficulties that foreign correspondents have there. So the title of this session, Covering a War with No Foreign Correspondents, is meant as a provocation because of course we know that there are still reporters in there, and hopefully there will be for some time to come. Here with us today I have Phil, who's the global editor-in-chief of the AFP. And when we first spoke a couple of months ago, I remember you said, we were kind of laughing about the title, and you said, a few months from now, in November, I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't any foreign correspondents left. Can you explain, what do you think of the situation today?
Well, I think there was a quantitative change around 6 months ago. I think for the previous sort of 18 months, 2 years of the conflict, it was very, very hard for foreign correspondents and journalists in general to work in Syria. It was extremely dangerous, but at the same time, it's our job, it's what we were doing, and there was a tremendous amount of very fine journalism from a lot of organizations from across the world. We saw the dangers with Marie Colvin and the terrible situation in different parts of Syria. Now, what happened? There were still kidnappings going on. The situation was getting worse and worse. But what happened around about 6 months ago, it really just became far too difficult to report from the rebel side. As we know, I think the actual figure of missing journalists, missing colleagues is not confirmed, but probably in the region of 25 to 30 of our colleagues are missing somewhere in Syria at the moment. And certainly we took the decision in about July, August, that really it had just become too dangerous for our people to be inside doing that kind of work on the rebel side. And as a result, also, we have a moral responsibility not to be encouraging freelancers just to fill the gap that has been created by the vacuum from there. So I think, as I said, there was a moment up until 6 months ago where we were inside, everyone was inside doing well, and 6 months ago now where we find ourselves in a very difficult and more dangerous situation.
So does that mean as a result that there's less coverage about Syria, or are you covering this in a different way?
For sure there's less coverage about Syria. I mean, I think from the beginning, the Syria conflict has also coincided with a very difficult economic climate of our industry. So I think even from the beginning, even over the last 2 years, we've been very aware that there's been fewer voices, fewer independent journalists on the ground. If you compare previous conflicts, be it Iraq, be it Bosnia, we know just the sheer quantity of journalists that have been on the ground witnessing different stories, different places, that it was much easier to build a clear patchwork idea of what was going on. From the beginning of this conflict, because of the economics of our industry, there have been fewer journalists there from the start. And now, because of the extreme dangers, that has become even more severe. And so there is much fewer voices now.
And could you say something perhaps about how your attitude as an organization has changed to using citizen media, and what the workflow looks like for working with digital media activists in Syria?
I think the key thing for us, and I think for many credible media organizations, is that social media is in no way a replacement for journalism. At the end of the day, social media for us is a source of information, and it's us that has to provide the journalism that actually makes that information credible. And so we do a tremendous amount of work working with activists, with bloggers, with social media material to verify, to authenticate, to actually really decide whether this comes to our journalism bar. So in actual fact, there's a huge amount of stuff we don't use simply because it doesn't pass our standards of what that is. And that's just pure journalism. We have a team in Beirut, Arabic-speaking team, that spent an enormous amount of time working with activists and really verifying their sources of information. So it is old-fashioned journalism that comes back to our interaction with this kind of content.
Also here we have Leila Nachawati, who's co-founder of a remarkable project called Syria Untold, which studies citizen media from Syria, especially focusing on civil society initiatives, peaceful resistance. But she, of course, also follows all kinds of social media, including images from the front lines. Leila, what do you know many, many people who are working as digital media activists in Syria. How do they work? How do they interact with the media? And how do you think things look from their perspective in terms of how the news coverage of this conflict is going?
I can tell you that right now, activists inside Syria, people covering their environments, people who are often not part of any military structure, but they're trying to cover civil initiatives on the ground, they feel very neglected by mainstream media, as if their voices were completely alienated in an increasingly militarized approach to the events in the country. And of course, there are endless geopolitical and geostrategic and military aspects, but there is this tendency to go back to these geopolitical filters. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we lack the context of the past 50 years in Syria. So besides the proxy war, besides the geopolitical context, there are internal dynamics. We tend to see, and this is something we usually see in Western media, we tend to see the region, we tend to see Arabs, we tend to see citizens in the region as moved by religious and identitarian factors. We forget the social, the economic, the political, internal dynamics and the social fabric itself. And I think it's key to understand this context, and not only these 2 years, but the past 50 years to understand where we are today. I think we are lacking this context, and I think this has to do partly with the kind of coverage we have right now. Syria went from being an information black hole for decades to being one of the biggest YouTube video producers in the world. But what do we do with all this information, with all these videos, if we don't have the proper context, the proper background to understand them and put them into place? So my work right now, and I think those of us in close contact with the country, with people working on the ground, is more and more the role of curators to actually provide description, context, based on our networks of trust. So I constantly keep asked, how do you verify the videos? I think it has a lot to do with building and having your own sources and your own network of trust to be able to know who to rely on and what kind of contents are reliable.
Melissa, you're the head of communications for the UNHCR. And you have been doing lots to cover this conflict, perhaps more than you would imagine for a UN agency that's dedicated to helping refugees. You've been hiring freelancers, hiring journalists. What has your experience been in terms of media coverage, and how are the images that you're sending out becoming a part of the greater media news coverage?
Well, maybe we're hiring the journalists you're all firing, but we are finding that there is quite a supply of talented, seasoned journalists out there who are looking for jobs and who could provide exactly the context that Leila said is absent. So I think, to echo Christiana Munpor's and Phil's point, we really do need this type of, we cannot cover this war without the people who know how to tell it. But how do you do it when it's too dangerous to cover? UNHCR has 350 staff inside Syria who basically, up until today, have not communicated because for other reasons, it's too dangerous. So we basically have a team of neutral people who are witnessing cross-line and in all parts of the country as they deliver to help the people of Syria. They're really witnessing what's going on. And as head of communications, and for a UN organization, I feel it's in our public service role to communicate what they are witnessing. For the most part, though, we have been delivering news, features, stories. We guide journalists. We provide them with access. We serve as a kind of news service, primarily focusing on the refugee situation in the neighboring countries and what those refugees are witnessing. Final point, I don't think UNHCR would be sitting up here 10 years ago. I think it's a reflection of the changing news business. It's up to you to judge whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But in terms of what that reflects, it's not that we're just producing and it's going on our website. We are producing and it is being delivered systematically to AFP, to the broadcasters of this world, in raw video form. We deliver photographs from the moment we see things, we witness things. And these are being considered, for the most part, credible, neutral, and usable. And I just wanted to leave that with you, perhaps to start a discussion.
I'm glad that Melissa brought up that point, because Phil, I wonder, I know Melissa says that they're neutral, but what do you think about that? I mean, we know that the Syrian media activists are not neutral. Is the UN neutral? Why are international news media agencies suddenly willing to take all this material that they know?
I think the approach to any form of material, be it social media material, be it material from the UN, from a blogger, from any source, it's just basic journalism. It goes back to the credibility of your source. We find a lot of the activists that we deal with are credible because we've dealt with them for a significant period of time. And generally, we find that they don't lie and exaggerate because there isn't really an interest to lie and exaggerate, because you will be found out. That's one of the great benefits of social media, is that it is much harder to lie about that kind of thing. So I think we should sort of demystify, a little bit demystify the social media thing. It is about a source in that sense. And you should interact with each individual activist, platform, whatever it may be, in terms of how credible is that source and how can you prove that. And you get that by doing your daily journalism, day-to-day, interacting on that level, and you build up the credibility of individual sources. When you have a bad experience with someone, somebody tries to manipulate something, manipulate the metadata, or change something within, you know you'll never ever use that source again. So it comes back, for me, to basic journalism.
We're going to be taking questions from the audience in a moment, so if you have questions, you can put up your hand. In the meantime, I'd like to ask Leila, because there's always a lot of focus on, well, can you trust these people on the internet, and are they shady? But how do the activists feel about the media? How are they trusting the journalists that they're working with? And what do you feel the overall impression is among Syrians?
Well, like I said, they feel very neglected. We see many projects that are actually now being run and curated by Syrian activists themselves, and then they put it out there, and whoever wants to use these contents, this is what we're doing at Syria Untold, we find it now we find it easier, or at least better for us, to try to do our job, which is curate this content, try to provide a reliable source for whoever organizations, journalists, media want to use this content, rather than trying to reach out to these journalists, because very often there's an interview at a given moment when there's this sudden interest, maybe because of the international political agenda, but then they're neglected again. So there's a mistrust. Right now, Syrians do not really trust that international mainstream media really care to know what's happening on the ground, because there is this monopoly of geopolitical and geostrategic filters.
I wonder, is Hans-Erik from Bambuser, is he in the audience right now? back here. I was wondering, Bamboozer is a live streaming service where people can broadcast live video from their phone, and they have a lot of people, young people in Syria, who are using the service to broadcast out to the world what they see. Hans-Erik, when we spoke a few weeks ago, you mentioned how impressed you've been with how these activists using your live streaming tool have been organizing behind the scenes, how their approach to the content distribution is. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. We worked quite a lot with activists during the Arab Spring in all those countries where that took place. Not much organization around that content that came out from those countries at that time. And I think the Syrians learned from that. So what we've seen over the past 2 years from Syria is very, very well organized live streams where they know exactly what they're going to stream. They have notified us ahead of what they're going to stream, so we can notify media that this is what's happening, but it's up to you to verify it to yourself. And they're keeping documentation on every live stream they do, where, when, and they have this huge spreadsheet. So I assume that's something they will use in the future if it comes to some kind of legal trial of the current government.
And you also mentioned something about the age of these activists. I was surprised to learn that most of the people that you've been interacting with are teenagers.
Not even teenagers sometimes. I've been watching videos shot by 11, 12-year-old people sitting on rooftops where mortars falling around them, trying to get someone to tell them to get out of there, but they're sticking there, and the average age of our users in Syria is probably around 15 or something like that. So it's very, very young people.
Phil, did you know that about the images that are coming from the front lines of Syria, that there are so many children and teenagers involved?
Well, we're aware of the extreme diversity of the people providing images, and also part of our interaction journalistically with people through Skype and so on and so forth. There is a lot of contact with children, with families, because that's the very nature of activists and how they're working. They're working in a house surrounded by the entire families. Our people who interact regularly with these people end up sometimes getting to know the families quite well. You know, one recent case, I think the wife of one activist actually came on the line and warned off one of our reporters for calling her husband rather too often late at night. So, these are different kind of relationships we're having to manage now. So certainly we're aware of that diversity of them.
Melissa, Leila mentioned something about how the activists are now communicating a lot among themselves and kind of developing routes to take around the international mainstream media. Do you think of your work in a similar way? I mean, are you competing with the international media or looking for ways to simply avoid them and communicate directly to audiences without a mediator?
I mean, I think what we have now in this new journalism age and this new media age is, as communicators for organizations, we continue to communicate in the traditional ways with traditional media. We are spokespeople, we appear as interview partners, we arrange visits, we provide access, we provide context, etc. The difference is we also have the opportunity to produce and publish ourselves on our own platforms, but as well to place our own media on big media partner platforms. We have a reality TV series UNHCR produced, A Day in the Life at the Zatri refugee camp, right now running on Yahoo in many countries in the world, a big media partner platform. The difference perhaps also is we might be considered cause journalists to a certain extent. I do believe that journalists themselves, and Christiane Amanpour mentioned this morning, she was recalling Bosnia, and that action would not have happened had she and other prominent journalists like her not been there and been calling attention to what is going on. We obviously are not in the business of just wanting to raise awareness, inform. We want to get people to care. This is a humanitarian disaster beyond comprehension. beyond what we have seen in several decades. We need to use effective storytelling, emotive storytelling, individual stories of survival, to move people, to hit people in the gut, as Christian also said, in order to get them to care, and then to perhaps say, what can I do? What can I do to get the political powers of this world to put an end to this conflict? What can I do to help that little refugee boy who is on the street selling flowers at midnight and is not going to school? How can I give? And so that's perhaps a little bit of a difference between what we're doing and what the news media are doing, but I think we play an important role, I think, as a unified information force.
Leila?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it's much easier now to have your own networks of trust now with the internet and social media than it used to be. But you have to nourish, you have to take care of your sources, you have to take care of your network. I get constantly asked by journalists on Twitter, can you hook me up with an activist in Hama who went through this and who speaks Spanish? Well, it doesn't work that way. You have to take care of people. You have to make them trust you. They're not going to tell you their lives and their fears and their hopes for the future and what they witnessed if they don't trust you. So it has to be something that you nourish. You can't come back after 6 months again.
They hacked our Twitter account. So
They hacked, yeah. Oh, I think it's back.
Leila, would you like to finish your point?
It's real quick. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is just don't let the names of the tools and the technicalities distract you from what really matters, which is to build your own network of trust using these tools. Take care of their of your sources. They will trust you, and that, I mean, there's no other secret recipe than this.
I wonder if there's anybody present from an Arabic language news channel who would like to come in on the discussion. I know that Nakla was here earlier. Is there anybody else? No volunteers? Maybe later. Do we have any questions at this point for the panelists? Amy has a question.
Is there a mic? Yeah, great. Well, I'm Amy Selwyn from News Exchange. I'm struck by something that you said, Melissa, which is that the job is to get people to care. And I think there is a distinction between, or maybe there isn't, a distinction between getting people to care or giving people information. And I know it's a subtle distinction, but I'd be very curious to hear what the panel thinks and possibly what other people in the audience think. Is it the news organization's job to get people to care?
I think from our overriding responsibility is to try to get to the proverbial truth. Away from there's always tremendous amount of emotion in all these situations. I mean, if you take, for example, the chemical attack in Damascus in August. Now, it's tremendously appealing when images are delivered to you by citizen journalists, by activists, and so on, to see that as a replacement for what we do. But we have, the key thing for us is a much bigger responsibility, is to actually really get down to the ground and to put that in context and to try to deliver old-fashioned truth as to what's going on. And that was something that got very much lost in that coverage. If you looked at people's stories very quickly, the key bit of context of that story was that there are no independent people on the ground to verify this piece of information. That was just dropping out of stories across the board as people just took the material and made their narrative. And as a result of that, you could then get a competing narrative, which the Syrian government says the rebels are to blame, and that's it. So then there are two competing narratives which are not in any way journalistically evaluated. And I thought it was very interesting that the person who really sort of helped to put that into context was actually C.J. Chivers of the New York Times, who, when the UN report came out, with his knowledge of Syria, with his military background, and he got his compass out and worked out where the shells had been fired from. And then he came out with a key piece that said, actually, this is where it came from. This is the truth behind this chemical attack, which until then, everyone had been in the dark. So for me, that's absolutely the key piece.
No, I agree. I mean, that is, I think without that, we wouldn't be able to do our job because it establishes the context, it establishes the truth. It's absolutely critical. In my previous incarnation, I was spokesperson for the IAEA, and when the chemical attack happened, it reminded me very much of Iraq and the absence of the weapons of mass destruction when we were actually reporting that there were no evidence of nuclear weapons anywhere. But I do think increasingly, and maybe not necessarily the news agencies, but there is a role for journalists as well, and you see it in a number of examples. You see it in a number of news features, and there is usually an individual story used to illustrate the hard facts. Mm-hmm. And the individual story of suffering, of triumph, of survival, does bring more readers, does bring more viewers, so I don't think it's very different. Maybe you're not your objective if you're setting your, what is AFP trying to achieve for this year? It's not, we're trying to get people to care about Syrian refugees. It is for us, but I think that you wouldn't say this wasn't a secondary objective.
I think it's an inevitable byproduct of good journalism, that the PU will engage people with your storytelling and they will care, exactly. and it will have, therefore lead to that result. Absolutely.
Leila, you mentioned earlier something about the lack of context, that journalists come into the country and don't necessarily understand the history of Syria, what the country used to be like before this current conflict, or even where the current conflict is coming. We had a question from Twitter earlier, I got it in my ear, about how do you generate interest and understanding about an age-old conflict? What are the tools, other than this frontline reporting, what are the tools that media can use to improve on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the key word here is listening to the voices on the ground, to the people who are living this in first person. So for me, I try to listen more to people who are actually experiencing and building something from under the rubble very often, and less to geostrategic experts who are analyzing the country from the outside. For me, it's much more valuable to follow these projects, people who are actually building. So there are endless stories right now in the liberated areas, liberated of course in quotation marks, but there are endless stories of self-management, self-government. There is now an initiative of young men and women riding, promoting the use of bicycles, which are traditionally associated with low-class means of transportation. So no one who can afford a car would actually ride a bike, unlike, for instance, in Europe. So there is now this attempt to promote the use of bicycles against pollution. I know this sounds surreal, but against pollution, and actually as a way to avoid checkpoints, which are usually for cars. So there are endless initiatives on the ground, and I think they're very important to get stories. For us as journalists, to get stories that people can actually relate to within this context of fatigue regarding Syria.
Phil, with the freelancers, you mentioned earlier that freelancers are going into the country no matter, what you do. People are very aggressively pursuing this story in spite of the dangers. Can you say something more about what your responsibility is vis-a-vis freelancers?
Sure. Well, one thing I would say is that mercifully fewer freelancers in recent months are going in, because the dangers now are just so extreme that I think the message is getting through. But I think this I think is something where the financial situation of our industry, of the media industry in general, has created a very difficult context when it comes to Syria. There simply are not the freelance dollars on the ground that will allow freelancers to work in a safe way. If you're going to be in Syria, there are real costs to being there. You need a safe driver, you need a safe fixer, you need the logistical support, you need your protective equipment. To work safely is expensive. And perhaps in previous contracts, in previous conflicts, there was a much bigger freelance dollar budget out there, people on bigger day rates, people having much more ability to protect themselves. And what we've realized here is that even if we have no relation to somebody, of course, there will be people who will be going into Syria with the idea of working for us without our knowledge. So in a sense, we have a responsibility to try to prevent people doing things that we would not approve of or that we couldn't condone. So we've had to change our way of working. We've had to, on occasion, absolutely tell people we will not take their production. If they go to this place, we will not take their production if they go there. We consider it's too dangerous for our people to go there. And even if they go there and have wonderful material and give it to somebody else, and it's a story that should be told, we have decided in advance we can't do that because we have to try to set some standards of safe behavior. It's a very, very difficult line to tread. But we've been trying to do that. We've been trying to bring in guidelines to say, well, any freelancer who works for us, we will give them protective gear, we will give them insurance, that kind of background. But the whole industry has really has to look at this issue in a big way, because I think, as Stuart said in the previous discussion, that throughout the Arab Spring, we've seen younger and younger and inexperienced freelancers just turning up in these conflicts and putting themselves and others in danger. And we're still looking at the consequences of that.
Leila, there's been a lot of talk recently about the 30 journalists who are kidnapped, and we know that there have been deaths and it's very dangerous. Is there any count of how many digital media activists have been kidnapped, incarcerated, killed? Who takes care of them, so to speak, or their families once they disappear, when they've shared images that get broadcast on international media?
I think we need first to redefine what we are talking about when we talk about journalists, online activists, media activists, content producers, because right now there are thousands, in Syria alone, thousands of people who are actually arrested, harassed, not only by the regime, but more and more by those trying to profit from the vacuum left by the regime in the north of Syria mainly. So groups like the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria are now harassing and arresting and killing people for peacefully demonstrating against extremism, against jihadism. So we have an example at Syria Untold. We highlighted the story of two sisters, Mace and I don't remember the name of the other sister, but one of them was kidnapped in Damascus by the regime for peacefully demonstrating against the repression of the regime. And then a few months later, the other sister was kidnapped by ISIS, by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, in Raqqa for peacefully demonstrating against the burning of churches. That is actually this ISIS group, the ISIS group are actually doing. So we have both right now. We have people trapped between the struggle against the regime and the struggle against these groups, and who are kidnapping, actually, the legitimate demands of Syrians.
All right, I think now there's a question, right before I'm going to finish. We'd like to have a question from the gentleman in the front. Thank you.
I'm Abdülhamit Bilici from Cihan News Agency in Turkey. As a journalist very close to the conflict of Syria, we are having all those difficulties, and I agree with some of the points that raised as the risk of life for journalists, and of course economic problems of all media organizations. But I have also, I'd like to invite all of my colleagues here that we should also self-criticize ourselves. You know, yes, there are risks of going to Syria to cover the conflict in the government side or in the opposition side, but are we giving enough attention to places that there is no much life risk? For instance, all refugees living in Turkey, in Lebanon, and in Jordan. And so I guess it should not be an excuse to keep our eyes shut to a very big conflict that all people here agree that it is one of the biggest conflicts that we are having. So the question is, are we really interested in to increase the care or the awareness of that crisis? Because this is, yes, there are geopolitical dimensions, but of course, first of all, it's a very big humanitarian crisis, and there are lots of angles that media can help and increase awareness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we go to the panelists? Okay. Melissa, I'm sure that sounds like music to your ears.
It does, and I have to say that there has been quite a lot of coverage because there is access, but for me it's never enough, and there are so many stories, so many testimonies. I mean, refugees are a reflection of what is happening inside Syria. They can provide tremendous material, eyewitness information. Of course, it has to be verified as well. Many refugees are outside and they have family members still inside and they're on the phones with them all the time. So it is a good news source to speak to refugees, and you do not have that danger. Also, refugees can point to a number of trends and issues that are extending the suffering beyond borders, the suffering of being in exile, the suffering of having once lived as a middle-class, prosperous citizen and all of a sudden living in poverty, not starving, having a shelter over your head, but losing the dignity you once had. The suffering of your child not being in school, the suffering of your girls facing new risks of sexual violence, et cetera. But then there's also the issues of beyond that move into Europe, exposing a number of important global issues, and that is access to protection for refugees. It is absolute, you know, the Lampedusa tragedy, and I'll leave it on that point. The Lampedusa tragedy was covered. It was one boat, and there were hundreds of deaths of Eritreans arriving on the shore. But 2 days later, there was a boat carrying 500 Syrians plus Palestinians from Syria who were escaping Egypt. They were living in Egypt before as refugees and decided it was now, because of the changes, impossible for them to live there. So they got on this rickety boat. They went to Libya. They went and got on, and the boat sank, and at least 300 Syrians or Palestinians from Syria died. And it was nowhere in the press because the press had already covered the other tragedy and they had moved on. So this is where there are all kinds of stories. That's not just a tragedy. It's a story about what the journey that refugees are having to take, having to leave to find safety, not only in the neighboring countries, but beyond. And it's huge. And I do not think there are enough news resources devoted to it. And that's why, you know, we're trying to fill the gap. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I encourage you to explore SyriaUntold.com for alternative news angles and alternative uses of citizen media. My own website, Global Voices, UNHCR. Thank you, AFP. Bye.
Thanks.